You're watching the English newscast on Future Television. I'm Linda Tamim, and these are today's top stories. Speaker Nabih Berri postpones a parliamentary session to elect a new president to March the 11th after an attempt to break the presidential deadlock failed for the 19th time. Former Prime Minister Saad Hariri meets with UN Special Coordinator for Lebanon, Sigrid Kaag, to discuss the presidential election stalemate, the Syrian refugee crisis, and other developments in the region. And the United Nations mediator on Syria, Staffan de Mistura, says the Syrian government is willing to suspend its aerial bombardment of the northern city of Aleppo to allow for a local ceasefire. Parliament Speaker Nabih Berri has postponed a parliamentary session to elect a new president to March the 11th after an attempt to break the 9-month-long presidential deadlock failed for the 19th time. Like previous attempts, today's session to elect a new head of state was doomed to fail over a lack of quorum, owing to the absence of an accord between the rival factions on a consensus candidate. Some 56 lawmakers representing the March 14 coalition showed up in Parliament. Lawmakers from MP Michel Aoun's Parliamentary Change and Reform Bloc, Hezbollah's bloc, and its March 8 allies have thwarted a quorum since April 2014 by consistently boycotting parliamentary sessions, demanding an agreement beforehand with their March 14 rivals over a consensus candidate. The failure to pick a successor to former President Michel Sleiman has plunged the country into a presidential impasse that has paralyzed Parliament and is threatening to cripple much of the government's work. Parliament Speaker Nabih Berri says parties must reach an agreement on a formula to replace the current decision-making mechanism in order to allow for Cabinet to resume its sessions. 3 days after Prime Minister Tamam Salam said he would not call for a Cabinet session until an agreement is reached, Berri told his visitors in Ain Tine that relevant parties must achieve an accord in order to enable government to resume its work and avoid the negative repercussions caused by the current deadlock. A weekly cabinet session scheduled for Thursday has been cancelled due to the aforementioned disagreement over a new decision-making formula. Lebanese Forces leader Samir Jaja has expressed regret that the state is decaying over the failure to elect a new head of state and expressed optimism on reaching an agreement with his rivals in the Free Patriotic Movement. During a press conference held at his residence in Ma'arab, Jaja said there was no reasons for vacuum and MPs should have gone to Parliament to choose a successor to President Michel Sleiman during the first session. He stressed that the decision to elect a new head of state lies in the hands of the Lebanese. The Lebanese Forces leader went on to say that Hezbollah chief Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah should not await an agreement from abroad and should send his MPs to Parliament to elect a president. Former Prime Minister Saad Hariri has met with UN Special Coordinator for Lebanon, Sigrid Kaag, to discuss the presidential election stalemate, the Syrian refugee crisis, as well as other developments in the region. Following the meeting at Hariri's downtown Beirut residence, Kaag said the talks addressed the need for continued support for all efforts made by the Lebanese government and Lebanese partners to maintain Lebanon's stability and isolate it from any dangers and threats. Kaag underlined the importance of respecting UN Security Council Resolution 1701 while pledging support for the government of Prime Minister Tamam Salam. Hariri also held separate meetings with Economy Minister Alain Hakim and a Qatar party delegation composed of MPs Eli Marouni, Nadim Jmayel, Samer Saadeh and Fadi Haber. An EU delegation has told Prime Minister Tamam Salam that the European Union is seeking to increase political and financial support to Lebanon in an effort to preserve the country's stability. EU Ambassador to Lebanon, Angelina Eichhorst, and a delegation from the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Commission has met with Salam at the Grand Sarai following a meeting with Foreign Affairs Minister Gibran Bassil. Citing threat of terrorism to Lebanon, the civil wars in Syria and Iraq, as well as the mass influx of refugees, Elmar Brok, chairman of the European Parliament Committee on Foreign Affairs, said the EU must help Lebanon so its stability won't be exposed to any turmoil. Brok said the deterioration of Lebanese security would be catastrophic and vowed the EU's firm support to prevent such an occurrence.
And we want, first of all, to show our solidarity to this country. We are all in a battle together fighting terrorism. And this country is in a very difficult situation because of civil war and terrorism in Syria and Iraq, your country has to carry so many refugees. And we have to be helpful in that. We have to be helpful because of that it could be destabilize this country, which would be of the utmost, it would be an utmost disaster if that would happen, and therefore we want to work closer together, not just financially but also politically, in order to come to a solution for the whole region. We know that your problems can be only solved if the origin of the problem, the situation in Syria and Iraq, can be solved. It can only be solved if it is clear that in these situations we are ready to do more against terror acts everywhere in the world, and therefore I hope we will be successful in this cooperation. Thank you very much.
The March 14 General Secretariat has emphasized the role of the state and the army in preserving Lebanon's security, rejecting the participation of Lebanese in foreign conflicts. A statement released following the group's weekly meeting says Lebanon's joining of the International Alliance to Combat Terrorism and Foreign Minister Gibran Basil's participation in the Jeddah and Paris conferences on terror demonstrate that protecting Lebanon is up to the state, government, army and international coalition. It remarked the state alone monopolizes the use of arms in accordance to the law and constitution, and any violation of this monopoly diminishes its authority. The head of the trucker syndicate has warned that the drivers will take action after claiming workers resumed filling the controversial fourth basin at the Beirut port in violation of an agreement that they had reached with Prime Minister Tamam Salam. Education Minister Elias Boussab said the warning of Naim Sawaya prompted work to stop. Earlier this month, the drivers suspended their open-ended strike and work in the basin was halted after Prime Minister Tamam Salam promised to find a solution to the row over the filling in agreement with all parties, including Christian religious figures. But Sawaya, who heads the syndicate, told Voice of Lebanon Radio that the filling resumed today. Boussab, who had previously mediated the case, told LBCI that he contacted Salam, who said he had no knowledge about the resumption of the activity on the basin. Moving on to Syria, battles in and around the Syrian city of Aleppo have killed at least 70 pro-government fighters and more than 80 insurgents after the army launched an offensive there. The army, backed by allied militia, had captured areas north of Aleppo yesterday in what the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said was an attempt to encircle the northern city and cut off insurgent supply lines. Aleppo is at the forefront of clashes between the army and a range of insurgents, including Islamist brigades, Al-Qaeda Syria wing, Nusra Front and Western-backed units battling President Bashar al-Assad. The United Nations is seeking a ceasefire there, a step towards addressing the crisis in Syria, which is about to enter its 5th year.
The government of Syria has indicated to me its willingness to halt all aerial bombing, all sorts, all types of aerial bombing and artillery shelling for a period of 6 weeks all over the city of Aleppo, from a date which we will be announcing from Damascus. Let's be frank, I have no illusions because based on past experiences, this will be a difficult issue to be achieved. But we will engage also very much the opposition, hopefully to see them to respond to a similar request from the UN to halt mortar and rockets on all over the city of Aleppo for 6 weeks. Meanwhile, we will also pursue the political process which Cairo, Moscow have generated and actually build on it with a UN initiative.
And coming up next, Ukrainian troops pull out of the hotspot eastern town of Debaltsev. More details after the break. Welcome back. U.S. Vice President Joe Biden has opened a 3-day White House summit aimed at countering the spread of violence extremism across the globe. He said societies must offer an affirmative alternative to extremism for immigrant communities, and solutions must go beyond military force, and that inclusion counts. President Barack Obama plans to address representatives from about 60 countries attending the summit on Thursday. The summit comes as the Islamic State group and a series of deadly attacks in Denmark, France, Canada and Australia have raised global fears about extremism and the radicalization of young people. Similarly, a two-day military gathering of the U.S.-led coalition against ISIS has kicked off in the Saudi capital, Riyadh. The meeting is attended by military commanders and chiefs of staff from the 22 countries in the U.S.-led coalition. Ukrainian troops have pulled out of the hotspot eastern town of Debaltseve after it was stormed by pro-Russian rebels in what the EU said was a clear violation of an internationally backed truce. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko said 80% of the 1,000 of soldiers in the town, a strategic railway hub sandwiched between the two main rebel-held cities of Donetsk and Lugansk, had withdrawn. Western countries blame the persistent violence on Russia. They say Moscow is cynically playing with a truce, which won unanimous backing from the UN Security Council on Tuesday to keep Ukraine destabilized. In fact, the EU and Canada this week ratcheted up sanctions on Russia over its perceived military role in the conflict. Russian President Vladimir Putin, who repeatedly denies directly helping the insurgency, had on Tuesday urged the Ukrainian soldiers in Debaltseve to surrender.
Russia champions the sovereignty of nations and then acts as if a neighbor's borders do not exist. Yet even for those of us growing accustomed to living in an upside-down world, the idea that Russia, which manufactured and continues to escalate the violence in Ukraine, has tabled a resolution today calling for the conflict's peaceful solution is ironic, to say the least. Bitterly ironic, given that this council has dedicated some 30 meetings to calling on Russia to stop escalating the very same conflict, and given the human consequences that are growing daily. Even as Russia puts forward this resolution, separatists that Russia has trained, armed, and that it fights alongside are laying ruthless and deadly siege to the Ukrainian-held city of Debaltseve, approximately 30 to 40 kilometers beyond lines established by the September Minsk agreements. But if Russia is committed to peace, it doesn't need a UN Security Council resolution to prove it. There are actually easier ways to prove it. You could stop arming the separatists, stop sending hundreds of heavy weapons across the border in addition to your troops, stop pretending you are not doing what you are doing, and start calling on and insisting upon the separatists observing the ceasefire around Debaltseve.
This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our headlines. Speaker Nabih Berri postpones a parliamentary session to elect a new president to March the 11th after an attempt to break the presidential deadlock fails for the 19th time. Former Prime Minister Saad Hariri meets with UN Special Coordinator for Lebanon, Sigrid Kaag, to discuss the presidential election stalemate, the Syrian refugee crisis, and other developments in the region. And finally, the United Nations mediator on Syria, Staffan de Mistura, says the Syrian government is willing to suspend its aerial bombardment of the northern city of Aleppo to allow for a local ceasefire. Those were your Wednesday headlines from us here at Future Television. I'm Linda Tamim, wishing you all a very nice evening.